Hey Gabe. Hey Jason. How's it going?
Good. How are you, Kira?
I'm good. I'm super excited to talk to you two about Mercury. Um, and I guess like just to start off, I like to kind of mark the date and time. Um, it is currently Thursday, August 13th, and it's 5:29 p.m. in Los Angeles, California. And I know both of you are on the East Coast.
I'm
Um,
not. I'm in the Midwest.
Oh, you're in the Midwest. Okay. So Gabe, I know, is in Jersey.
Yeah.
And Jason, where are you?
I'm in St. Louis, Missouri.
Awesome. Cool. So yeah, I mean, let's start off by having you two introduce yourselves. If you're comfortable with sharing your sun, moon, and rising, that'd be cool. And tell us about like your astrology practice or how you use astrology. Um, Gabe, why don't you start?
All right. I'm Gabe Rosas. My sun, moon, and rising is Virgo, Libra, and Gemini. So I'm a little mercurial. So I think I fit this podcast
A
today
little bit.
a little bit. My practice is mostly Hellenistic, um, with a little bit of medieval in there. I started out with medieval years and years ago, doing the Robert Zoller course, and from then on, I just kept going backward in time. And so then I ended up uh, studying with the people at Project Hindsight for a bit, and then have pretty much been messing around on my own for a little while now. So, but
Cool.
that's sort of my trajectory.
Yeah, and you don't have a client practice yet, or
Yeah,
maybe yeah.
the plan is September. Let's see
Okay.
if
Nice.
I actually hold to the plan.
Are you trying to work with Mercury and Virgo? It's only in Virgo for like a little bit though.
Only for a little bit, so I don't have a lot of time. But I've been dragging myself to do this for so long. I might as well just jump in the most ridiculous point.
The most ridiculous astrology of 2020.
Yeah, yeah, and actually, I think for this year, Virgo is the ninth in the my solar return, so I think that
Okay,
actually fits.
cool.
Nice.
That's exciting. So people, I don't know, if you haven't heard of Gabe, that probably means that you're not on Twitter, and that you don't engage in Astro Twitter. But Gabe is kind of like just like a constant when it comes to Astro Twitter and that whole community. Um, and more than just supplying like all the likes to all the good posts, Gabe is, I mean, Sam Reynolds, who was on the pod for the first episode, actually mentioned you, Gabe, in that episode, but often refers to you as his like his secret weapon, because you're one of these people in the astrology community who's like in the community, doesn't really produce much content related to astrology, but like secretly knows so much shit, like scarily
Sweet
amount
sleeper
of
agent.
yes. And we'll talk about that in relation to Gabe being super mercurial and just like knowing all the things, but Gabe is like extremely well studied, and you wouldn't necessarily know that until you have a conversation, but then you're like, holy shit, how do you how do you know all this and you're not like sharing it with the world? Like that's the main thing. Only on the low. But yeah, thank you for introducing yourself. And you said you're located in Jersey. Is it Jersey
Yep,
City?
I'm north of Jersey City,
Okay,
so
cool.
that's the closest big locale.
Are you from Jersey?
Yes, I was born in Jersey City, so
Okay.
I'm Jersey born and raised, like
And stayed.
Springsteen, and
I've been
stayed.
to Bruce Springsteen's Sting Spruce. You know what I'm trying to say. I've been there. I've been to his house. I met his whole family and his
Wow,
dogs. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
that's interesting.
So random, but that's just a random. I like to tell people that because it's like I got to shake his hand and play with his dogs.
You
Amazing.
got to touch the boss.
Yes, that's the thing. I've like never been a spring. I can't say Springsteen. I can't. I've never been a Bruce
Springsteen.
S fan. But it's still cool to kind of like tell people that because obviously he's a big deal. Anyway, Jason, hi.
Hi.
Tell us about yourself and your SMR and your astrology practice and all that.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, Sun, Moon, Rising, Virgo, Gemini, Virgo. So probably all the qualifications I need for this talk there. It's ridiculous once I learned to see all that clearly. I was like, this is the most narrowly focused chart ever. Anyway, yeah, let's see. I feel like I've had in my very mercurial mode, had a flirtation with astrology for a long time, but didn't actually get serious with my studies until the end of 2018, really. I'd been exposed to some traditional material, which intrigued me just because it just felt like way more systematic than what I'd encountered with modern astrology before that. But there wasn't really anywhere for me to, or I guess I didn't really know about Project Hindsight when I stumbled on some of that. So it was just kind of in the background of my awareness for a while. And then I moved to like a really small town in central Missouri, and then went to another small town in Northern Virginia, and basically just was bored and was like, well, what can I fill my time with? And decided to return to a study of astrology. And by that time, Chris's book had come out, and yeah, that's when I started going deep, and that's when I started connecting with astrology Twitter, and being a little bit more embedded in the community that way. And once I went to NORWAC in 2019, it was just kind of all over for me, as far as just like, okay, this is going to be where I hang out for a long time. I don't really have much of a practice. I still consider myself sort of an advanced beginner at best. I feel like I learned so much from my peers, and I'm starting I just started a more formal study with Achyuta Bhavadas through Nightlight Astrology to really kind of plug in some of my holes in terms of my foundations for Hellenistic astrology, which is, yeah, the mode that I felt the most resonance with. I guess that covers it for my astro history for right now. We'll see where other things become relevant.
Yeah, you have something that always kind of intrigued me about you is that you have like a background in a lot of different things too. Like outside of astrology, you have a background in Eastern medicine and acupuncture, which you don't do anymore, and herbalism. And we've talked about that like in New York too when you visited. But curious if that like a lot of that knowledge carries over to like your studies with astrology.
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah, Chinese medicine, when you kind of get deep into like the core philosophical foundations of it, which is really just rooted in a broader Chinese like naturalistic cosmology. There's a conceptual and symbolic like neatness to how all the pieces sort of fit together. Certainly like the 5-element or the 5 phases model, and all the kind of like concentric circles of correspondences between each one, which, a particular element like wood would connect to a particular season, which would be spring, and connects to a particular emotion, which would be anger, and it just kind of like extends out and out and out like that. So like once I started getting really deep into astrology, and especially into the traditional material, it was just structured so similarly. Although kind of the fiveness of the 5-phase theory does present some different dynamics to the 4-ness of like classical like 4-element theory, but both ways of thinking require a very like systemic and kind of like ecological way of thinking about the thing as a whole. And so once you start thinking about one thing, the threads that connect that node to the rest of the system are always sort of like present at the same time. So if I say, you know, this one piece of whether it's astrology or Chinese medicine, like somebody that's steeped in it will have thought of like the four other things that it's like immediately connected to. So there's something about those types of conceptual schemas that I find a really like natural draw towards. Like it's, yeah, I don't know how to describe it because it's like very visceral for me. It's like there's an aesthetic appeal to like the tidiness of it, but also like the simplicity of like the basic building blocks and the infinite complexity that emerges from that is just it's just exciting to me in ways
so
that
Mercurial.
Are sometimes hard to verbalize. Yes,
indeed. And yeah, you mentioned NORWAC being kind of like this moment in time where you've really felt super immersed within the community. And that's where we met for the first time. I know we were acquainted through Twitter. And Gabe and I had met through the New York City astrologer dinners that I was organizing when I was living in New York. I think the first time we met Gabe was it through Kelly? Was it when Kelly was in
It was
town?
definitely through Kelly. That was the first dinner I went to, was the one with Kelly.
Okay.
But I could have sworn I met you at, didn't I meet you at UAC for like a hot second? Or
nope, I wasn't there.
You weren't there? Okay, then it couldn't have been UAC then. That's just the whiskey talking from the Chicago hotel.
No, I think it was that. Because I remember
so,
like Kelly, I was organizing that and Kelly was like, can you also invite Gabe and like maybe like 2 or 3 other people like Sam? And I was like, yeah, of course. And then, yeah, so that must have been the first time we met in person. But I knew you from Twitter, like the guy who likes all my tweets.
I know. And it was like, I knew you from Twitter. I was like, oh, this is the person who's holding all these dinners that I'm not going to. And
but then you started coming to all
like
of
this
them.
has this huge like, he had this like already huge presence on Twitter.
I don't think so. Maybe like
you had like 10,000 followers.
Really?
I think.
I don't think so.
You must have had a lot.
I don't know.
Like, you had the magazine. You're doing the
yeah.
And so it was like, oh wow, this person's up and coming with a bullet and
moving and shaking.
Let me get in some of that dinner. And then you brought us to, I think the first time was in the city, wasn't it?
Yeah, that Indian place.
It was an Indian place. And that was all right. Oh, yeah, no, it was Pana. It was Pana 2.
Yeah.
By the way, Pana 2 is like the best Indian place in Manhattan.
Only because of the decor. Because it's literally like, you go there, they were like shitty in terms of customer service. I was like, you guys suck.
Customer service is garbage, but it still feels authentic.
It feels really authentic. It's that place you've probably seen if you ever like, I don't know, there's a lot of, it's like very popular in terms of the decor because it's like you walk in and you're surrounded in like all these multiple colored lights, and it's very like small in there, so you kind of like all cramped together and there's just lights everywhere. I know friends who've like gone there tripping shrooms because it's just like very very magical looking in there. But yeah, we had a really good time. That was really fun. Yeah. And you were at NORWAC 2019 too. So did you guys meet there?
Yeah, I think that was probably the first time I met.
Yeah, in person, I'm pretty sure. I don't think I knew anyone from Astrology Twitter until I actually went to NORWAC. Yeah, not in person.
Yeah.
Yeah, I met you there. Sense. I didn't see you too much because NORWAC was huge, and so it was easy to like get lost and like not see somebody and not see them till like Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
I could always see you, Gabe, because you were smoking. I go out for a smoke.
Yeah, I go out for a smoke and wander back in, and I'm like carousing around everybody. And I think when you left, I remember when you left, Jason, you gave me whiskey.
Oh, I did. I
Or
bought
bourbon.
some.
I think it was bourbon.
It
I
was
forget which
bourbon.
one. I
It
forget
was
what it was
bourbon.
because I don't think we ever got the. Because I brought it to the last night because at Norwalk a bunch of people were hanging out like every night, and so I brought it to the last night, and I don't think we ever got to your bourbon. I think somebody took it.
Gotcha.
Oh, damn.
I'm not sure who.
Yeah, I bought it intending to share, and then like
Yeah.
it just sort of like didn't quite happen the way that I thought it would. So then I had like way too much whiskey at the end. I was like, Gabe, you're hanging out for a while, right? Here, share.
If anyone's listening, the key to Gabe's heart, and honestly, I know Jason, I know you enjoy a good bourbon / whiskey as well. So
Right now.
the key to both of these men's hearts is a really nice brown liquor. That's something I've learned through experience knowing you too. Okay, yeah. So let's talk about Mercury. Quickly, let's run through our Mercury placements. I have Mercury in Sagittarius. It's exactly conjunct my midheaven, like within a couple minutes, and so it's very loud and out there and unavoidable. But it's also in detriment, which is why I wear my Mercury talisman all the time. Whenever I'm doing anything explicitly Mercurial, to kind of like help me navigate, because I can get very tongue twisted, tongue tied, as you can see. It doesn't keep me from doing that completely, but it helps, I think. Gabe, how about you? Where's your Mercury?
My Mercury is in Libra, about to conjoin Mars in about 20 minutes of arc.
Damn.
And that coupled with Venus in Virgo is like it sort of helps, kind of. I mean, it's not the best place for Mercury, but at least it's in triplicity. It's an air sign, so it fits.
It's a very sweet mutual reception.
Yeah. It works out, sorta, and they almost oppose each other's antitia at the same time. So it's almost like a sorta opposition, if you want to use that tradition.
Interesting.
So it's weird.
I kind of think of it as like Mercury and Virgo are next door, Mercury and Venus are next door neighbors, and they're like in each other's homes, but like they can't see what the other one's doing. They kind of just have to trust that they won't destroy their homes.
Exactly.
And like if they were like if their homes were across the street from each other, that may be a little bit easier, because they can like peer over, but it's hard when they're like right next to each other. That's kind of how I picture it in my brain.
Yeah.
And yeah, so your Mercury, well, for both of you, Mercury is your chart ruler, who rules your ascendant and your sun. So big, like that's, I mean, spoiler alert, that's why I asked these two to talk to me about Mercury, because they're both pretty Mercurial and Mercury ruled. So yeah, I love that. And what degree is your sun at?
5.
Okay, so it's pretty close to my descendant, because I have my chart ruler is in Virgo. I have Jupiter in Virgo at 11, but my descendant is around 8 degrees. It's like 7 and 50 some minutes. So yeah, pretty close. And how about you, Jason? Where's your sun and where's your Mercury too?
All of it's in Virgo.
I mean, degree-wise, I'm trying to ascertain our synastry.
My sun is at 14 Virgo, and Mercury is in their own term at 1 degree. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So Mercury pretty close to Regulus.
Uh-huh.
And in its own term. That's pretty... Yeah. I mean, that doesn't surprise me because, again, like you're very Mercurial, and the way that you seem to express that is very, like, I don't know, it just feels very, like, it feels pretty Regulus-y, like very composed, and like the way that you are with words just like blows my mind because I cannot.
Thanks.
I'm so jealous of people with Mercury and Virgo, which is why I wear a Mercury and Virgo talisman.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's also has a out of sign conjunction with Mars, which is on the other side in
Oh,
Leo
oh,
at
so
28 Leo.
you both have that Mars Mercury thing. Cool.
Mine's a little, maybe slightly softer and quieter because that's all happening in the 12th.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and my Mercury is also has like a super tight aspect with uh, sextiles Pluto and trines Neptune within 1 degree for both of them.
Wow. Wait, so okay, so both of you, and you're both Gemini moons, right? Wow. Okay, so
Oh, I'm Libra moon.
oh, you're Libra moon. Okay,
Yeah.
Gemini
Oh,
rising.
that's right.
Okay, so
Yeah.
so yeah, Mercury's plays a really big role in both of your charts because it rules your ascendants. Jason, for you, it rules both of your lights. Are you a day chart or night chart?
Day chart.
Day chart.
Yeah,
Okay, cool.
and it's morning star
I was gonna
Mercury
ask
too.
that. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
that's wow, what a beautiful what a beautiful thing. I cannot relate. I'm like a very evening star. Like I'm pretty sure it was visible. Um it's about like it's about like 25 degrees off my sun. Um so it's pretty it was like very much an evening star Mercury. I'm very much a day chart person, and Mercury it is in its own term though, which I think helps a little bit. And it has a mutual reception with Jupiter and Virgo. So or you know, I forget who Sam said this, but there's an astrologer who describes it as mutual deception. So
Oh,
there's
It probably
that.
is Samuel. That sounds like Samuel, right?
Well, Sam quoted another astrologer, and
Mm.
I don't remember if it was like Bernadette Brady or Lee Lehman. It was some other big name astrologer who's also a woman that I forget. I forget who it was. But let's get into it. Let's talk about Mercury and its general significations, both like modern and traditional. I mean, the three of us are primarily traditional astrologers. I think we like almost all of us started out as modern, you know, getting into it through modern, but regardless, talking about Mercury, so Mercury is the fastest moving planet, aside from the moon, and it is the closest to the sun, and it's referred to as the messenger god. If you're looking at, you know, the correspondences between the Roman and Greek gods, Hermes or Mercury, excuse me, is referred to as the messenger. And I always looked at that as like it's zipping around the sun, and if the sun kind of represents like Helios, meaning like God or like the center and the source, or even like the heavens even. And Mercury has this ability to translate the messages from divine to to us mere mortals on earth. And that's kind of the imagery that comes to mind when I think of Mercury being the messenger god. um, yeah, what do you guys think? Like, what are some things that, like, the first kind of things that come to mind when you think of Mercury and its general significations?
Well, one of the things that gets overlooked is Mercury's love of contention. I mean, Mercury being in a lot of ways the opposite of Jupiter, where Jupiter wants to support and grow and help develop things. Mercury is more in a mood to test things and challenge things, not in a Marsy way, not in a way of testing to the death, but more in the testing of like, what's this about? Let me shake this around and see what happens. And you see that in its significations. Mercury usually gets lawyers, it gets wrestlers and athletes, it gets generals of armies, uh, people who fight, or people who are involved with conflict or challenge, or I think in Greek the word that gets used is agon, which we get agony from, but it means more struggle and contest. And that's a sort of thing that sort of gets passed over in the more modern things where, oh, he's a messenger, he's darting around, he likes to talk a lot, la da da. And those are ancient too. Communication, speech, writing, speech making, literally like orators, and knowledge. In one aspect that it shares with Jupiter is that they're both about knowledge and wisdom. They may take on the knowledge and wisdom in different ways, but that doesn't mean that the knowledge and wisdom that Mercury has is not as good as Jupiter's. It's coming at it from a different angle. But Jupiter's got the big picture thing going on. Mercury wants to know what the details are, what the little contentious bits are, and has that more zoomed in micro focus.
Love that. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, like I was thinking about that, the planetary contrariety between Mercury and Jupiter a lot, like in anticipation of this call. And yeah, I think it really does bring out a lot of some of those lesser emphasized significations of Mercury in kind of more like popular astrology. Yeah, because it does end up taking on some significations that feel like Marsy, but it's different from Mars, because like Mars, like when Mars has an argument, things like tend to break, and things tend to get like split.
It's there to break. It's not there to test. It's there to just destroy.
No. Yeah, so that's the way in which like Mercury is. That's why Mercury is like not classified as a malefic, even when it expresses that signification of like argumentation, because it's like there's not malice kind of associated with it. Really, it's in true like Mercury, like not of either sect way, is not it's more of just like this like childlike, like, oh, I wonder what's going to happen if do like, and that's sort of that plays into that trickster archetype. So it's like, it's not like I'm trying to like hurt anybody's feelings. It's like I just want to know what happens, and so there's like this I think in that expression, like Mercury's archetype has seems to express a big like love of like experience of like sort of in this world kind of way. Of course, Mercury in a different configuration also could seek for transcendence too, but I feel like the nature of its like contention and testing is because it sort of like wants to see what the world and experience is all about, which I know we'll get to this later in our outline, but those are definitely things I think a lot about with Mercury in Gemini and in Sagittarius.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, there is this, when I think of Mercury, I think of like its relationship with the sun and how the sun is emitting, and the sun has this correlation with intelligence and like our spirit and even like our soul, and Mercury does the job of like translating that and like putting words to it and like labeling and naming those things. And it's really about how it's emitting, or not, it's the sun is emitting, Mercury is like how it's the translating aspect of it. And like
right, it gives it articulation because the light of the sun is a unitary force. Like that light makes possible distinction, by casting light upon things, that you can distinguish one thing from another thing, and kind of also in that way that it casts shadow. But the light emanating from the sun itself is kind of like a oneness kind of quality to it. So it requires sort of a refractory function in order to kind of like make the light of the sun sort of intelligible. And that's sort of how I think about what Mercury is doing, which is really interesting, kind of like, thinking about that visible astronomy of like Mercury never being able to get that far away from the sun. So that's like, it is the close relationship, but it's also the way in which there's always a little bit of a built-in difficulty as far as like, you got to be sort of far enough away from the sun to do that articulating well, but stay close in order to still be like connected to it. So that closeness is also going to make that expression of distinction more challenged potentially. Yeah, I don't know. That was another piece I think I was considering a lot, is that proximity to the sun and Mercury's sort of like, it's accustomed to sort of being accustomed to immolating on the regular. It's, I mean, the amount of time that it's actually visible in the sky at any given point is much less common than with the other planets. So there's this interesting like flirtation with visibility that's part of Mercury as well.
Yeah. And speaking of that, can we kind of speak on Mercury's cycle and the way that it retrogrades more than any other planet, and then therefore it has these cazinis, these exact conjunctions with the sun, about 3 times a year, whereas all the other planets only get it once a year. I mean, not even every planet gets it once a year. Would Mars get it, I guess? Yeah.
I think everyone's going to get it at least once, because they can't move fast enough to get away from the sun.
Right.
It only matters if
it's like the retrograde. Cazimi doesn't happen every year.
No, not every calendar year. I mean, as part of the cycle, it's part of, it's basically the start of the cycle. But
yeah, Mercury gets it more than anyone.
Because it can only go so far. It can only go at a maximum about 28 degrees away, and usually it doesn't even get that far. It's usually about 25 degrees when it starts to slow down in its motion. So I mean, also we're discounting the moon, which does it every month, but that's different thing altogether. So that's part of, as Jason pointed out, it's part of the issue with Mercury is trying to get out of the spotlight into its own. Like, you want the light to shine on you, not to be. You don't want the light to like disappear you.
Right.
So Mercury does have that problem, but it's because it's the only planet that has that problem. It's a different relation than, say, if it was some other planet that gets put under the beams. They're used to not having that condition very much and for very long. They usually have it like maybe 2 weeks. Depending how we do it. Like if we do it at 15 degrees, maybe about a month max for like the outer planets or whatever. But Mercury is in that field most of the time. So you sort of get used to, I mean, I think of Mercury as more acclimated to being in that situation. And part of Mercury's thing is adaptability and changeability and being whatever it needs to be at the moment of time calls for.
Which kind of makes me think about the fact that it is invisible so much of the time, and how Mercurial people like that. Well, at least that kind of goes along with like the almost sneakiness of Mercury, where it's like there, but you might not be able to see it all the time. It's kind of like operating in the shadows sometimes. And then it has this like
shows up and then it leaves when you
yeah, it
turn your
shows up.
eyes ahead.
Exactly.
You ain't
Yeah.
gonna miss them cows.
It's so hard. Even when Mercury is visible, it is so hard to see. Like I remember, I think I've only seen it maybe twice, and the one time was during the Great American Eclipse in August 2017. Mercury was really close to the sun and moon during that eclipse. I remember being like, is that Mercury? I think that's Mercury. And then like, only really fully appearing for like a second or so. And yeah, I think another time when, I don't know, I think I saw it one time at sunrise, but like it's so hard to see because it is this tiny little glimmer of light. And that really to me speaks to the nature of Mercury being like, did you see it? Like now you see it, now you don't. Sort of like that, truly like that magician archetype.
Totally. Yeah, and the back and forth movement in my mind also kind of like conjures an image of like a sewing machine or that thing, I forget what it's called, in a big loom, like the something shuttle that like goes back and forth, that like
Yeah.
it's just
Yeah.
constantly like and
Yeah.
like kind of doing that across the zodiac with the sun, which yeah, again totally plays into that like connecting element of its signification. Yeah, I feel like I've been thinking, I've thought like going into when COVID sort of arrived in the US, and my city went into shelter in place, and we were all kind of like in this like 12th house mode. I was thinking a lot about like Mercury and sort of my own trajectory in terms of like profession, or maybe even just like what work I'm doing in the world on a smaller scale. And I think something that I really was like wrestling with, really kind of like rolling around in my own mind is, because I was raised kind of in this like American culture, like I feel like there's this huge like solar emphasis, right? It's like we're all like supposed to be like sovereigns in our own right and like shining out brightly in the world, which I think when you take that in a certain way is probably a really healthy thing, but in our particular cultural context, there's plenty of not so healthy ways for that to show up. And I guess I was considering how, with Mercury being so prominent in my chart and how like it spends so much time invisible, it's like what would sort of accepting and taking seriously that piece of it like look like? And I think that does tie into some of the other correlations that Mercury has to sort of like people in this more assistant role or this more like ministerial role. It's like it's adjacent to the monarch, and literally just kind of orbiting the king or queen or whatever sovereign, and sort of attending to kind of from the wings. Yeah, and the meditations and prayers I did around that seem to have lined up well with like me ending up with the new job that I have now, which is like as an administrative assistant with an organization that like works with kind of like ancestral healing, which is also really funny for me, like thinking about that aspect that my Mercury makes to Pluto, the Lord of the Underworld. So it's like, there's also this like psychopomp element that's like being brought into play with that too, because it's like it is invisible a lot of times, but it's invisible to the above world, and it just sort of like switches its visibility over into the underworld. So I feel like all of that is really like sort of the less spoken about elements of Mercury's nature.
Totally. I love that. Where's your Jupiter? I have to ask. I forget.
Mine is in Aquarius.
Okay. Oh, cool. Jupiter return coming up.
Yeah, quite a return.
Yeah. I love that you brought that up though about how like it's constantly moving from the above world to the underworld, and like as Jason Holly would say, like day consciousness and night consciousness. And yeah, I mean, like all the planets go through that, but the fact that Mercury does it so often and then, has this regular purification by like, being in the heart of the sun every, season, basically every three months or so. Um, and yeah, like what that means to be, or I guess, yeah, for this planet to be, part of its like thing is the fact that it's like constantly meeting up with the sun, and almost like, yeah, there's like this purification ritual that happens with the Mercury Kazemi. And for us, I mean, depending on if it's inferior or is it, would that happen? Yeah, it goes between inferior and what's the opposite of that? Exterior?
Superior.
Superior. This is why I need my Mercurials around, because I don't know. Yeah, so it kind of goes between these, but it has this moment of like, it's almost like, every couple months Mercury gets to like go into the palace and meet with the king or queen or whoever, and then receive, it's almost like being able to like sit on their lap and receive like the divine word or something. And yeah, it's cool because it, yeah, there's something to that, I feel like, that mercurial people have this sort of connection to intellect through that like continuous, purification from the sun, whereas like the other planets all have that too, but it's it's less frequent, and therefore not as much of like a central part of their significations.
Right. For the other planets, it's just sort of part of this like built-in like phasic like life cycle element to it. But yeah, like that dying and being reborn thing is just sort of normal for Mercury.
Yeah.
Yeah, and let's talk a
Mercury's a
little bit.
psychopomp.
Yeah.
So one of the
Like,
things.
oh, we're gonna die now? Cool. It's like, oh, we're going
Oh,
back.
we gotta go
We're being
back. We
born
gotta go to
again.
Hades and back, and we're set.
Yeah.
Gotta
It's
go
like
pick
fun
up.
down
you
there.
you need anything while I'm at the store?
Yeah.
Exactly. I'm making a pizza run.
down to
I gotta drop off
hell.
these cows I stole, and then I'll be back.
I don't get distracted.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about the adaptability nature to Mercury. I mean, it is this like it rolls over to the bicorporeal signs and has this like double-bodied nature to it, being a planet that rolls over two mutable signs. Um, and especially like in recent times, people have been referring to Mercury as queer, or as, when people are gendering planets, they'll refer to Mercury with they them pronouns, which I tend to do as well, because, well, I guess to start out, there is this thing having to do with sect, and that's SECT, and how Mercury doesn't necessarily belong to one sect or the other. It's whereas that's the sects. That's God. The sects um, are pretty like there are two different teams, and those teams are like set. There's the day sect, which is the Sun, Jupiter, Saturn, um, and that's the day team. And then you have the night team, which is the moon and Venus and Mars, and that's just that period. Like that's those are their teams. And then you have Mercury, which can go either way, and it can go either way. And it basically depends on if it's a morning star or an evening star. If it's rising before the sun, then it is part of the day sect, and if it's rising or setting after the sun, then it's part of the night sect. Yeah, what do you get? What are your thoughts around Mercury being this very mutable, adaptable, changeable figure, but also maybe speaking on how it kind of is genderless in that way as well?
You want to start, Jason, or do you want me to jump in?
You can jump in. I
I'll
I love the
jump in.
Mercury Mars. You're just like ready. I love it
Ready.
so much.
I mean, part of this is a huge digression when we go to talk about the gender of the planets.
Mm-hmm.
Or I personally I don't like the idea of the planets having a gender, because they're not they're not human personages. They're personages, but not human personages. And so they like certain genders. I tend to look at it that way, that they have a preference, but they are not pinned down or limited, because they are the source of limiting. Then they are not limited in themselves. And with Mercury just, like, it's not so much that Mercury has no gender, is that Mercury has no preference at all. So it can do whatever it wants, gender-wise or not, depending on whatever mood takes Mercury's mind.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, along with all the other changeability, as you brought up, maybe in this chart it favors the diurnal sect, maybe in this chart it's the nocturnal sect, maybe in this chart it favors the malefics, maybe in this chart it favors benefics. There is this whole there are like bits and pieces in the tradition of when Mercury may or may not prefer one thing or another, based on its aspects, based on its solar phase. Like if it's a rising sign, maybe it's more of it's like subbing in as a diurnal planet in that chart. Or if it's a setting phase, it's subbing in as a nocturnal planet. If it's aspect benefics, it's benefic, or it's going to be favorable to benefics. And likewise with malefics, if it's aspect malefics, then you got to figure out like which is the most close aspect or whatever. And it changeable in its nature, changeable as the days go by, and in people's lives, it becomes a matter of, okay, how does this congeal for that moment when this person shows up? What mood was Mercury in that day to do what he wants? And obviously for some people, he was in a very gender fluid mood, and for others, not quite the factor. And clearly the hounds of Hermes are are making their thoughts known.
Is that
But
from me or you? It's probably from me.
yeah, it sounds on your end.
Okay, yeah. There's a dog, a little tiny yappy.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
what I thought.
If Mercury had hounds, they would be very small dogs.
Yes.
They'd be heavy.
He's really cute. He's like a miniature schnauzer.
They
but
have to be
they're-
travel friendly.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Hopefully he'll stop
Perfect
soon.
Mercury dogs. Amazing.
Yeah. Jason, do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah. I guess the quality of this like changeability, this like lacking of preference, in a certain way, just kind of like brings my mind to the association of Mercury to the youth and youthfulness and children, and thinking about like sort of developmentally, like kind of like the way that children are when they're young. They are these super impressionable beings that have not cohered a sense of like self or gravity and are still kind of in this very like learning and collecting mode. So there's not as much judgment, is whatever is happening becomes like the norm for a child. And I think that captures really well sort of like where Mercury's like flexibility and changeability comes from, because it is connected to sort of this like it resonates with this sort of earlier part of the life cycle where we're just really super like open, and like our like brains are still developing, and like we have maximum neuroplasticity. So it's like, oh, we can just sort of like change the wiring whenever, however we need to, depending on what is happening. And I think this also probably relates back to, its orbit and proximity to the sun. We can also think if the sun is like the father, or just, a strong like central parent figure, then we also see this little child kind of running back and forth around their parents. And that it's almost like that proximity preserves the youthful quality of Mercury. It's like if Mercury was capable of getting any further away from the sun, Mercury would be able to individuate more completely into like their own being, but they never do. So like they retain that childlike quality as a permanent feature. I think it's also really interesting for me to think about that quality of change and impressionability with the moon as the two sort of fastest moving planets. But I think where they diverge is like certainly in kind of, it seems like more, medieval traditions where the like temperament of the planets is sort of brought into play a little bit more centrally. The moon is sort of seen as this watery planet.
Moist.
And yeah, exactly.
I just wanted to say that word.
Disturb anyone.
Moist. Okay.
Moist.
Now you have to give a trigger warning at the beginning of this.
I know, right?
Yeah, so like that kind of pointing to water as a medium that retains things, and in the same way the moon is a thing that like not only distributes the influences of the planets, but also like collects them, like takes them into herself, and like it sort of becomes like part of her body for a time. And so that also that connection to memory. But like if Mercury is said to have any intrinsic kind of like temperament or elemental quality, I've always seen it as like slightly dry. So like the kind of opposed to the moistness, the wetness of the moon. So it's almost like Mercury like doesn't really remember what it takes on. Like it just like takes it on for that moment, and then it's like gone like the next. Whereas like there's more of a momentum to like what the moon is carrying. So its change is much, even though the moon moves faster, I kind of think of like Mercury's like changing quality as being swifter or even less permanent than
more
the moon
fickle.
is.
Yeah. Another thing that comes to mind when we're talking about the Mercury and its changeability is the fact that it can only be visible during sunrise or sunset, and how it has its joy in the first house, partly for that reason, like it's a place where it can actually be seen at sunrise. And yeah, I guess I just wanted to note that like part of it is the fact that like Mercury is only visible during these moments of change, like these periods of time during the day where the light is changing, the like literally everything about what's visible is changing during those brief moments. And how Mercury only comes out to like say hi during those very changeable moments in the day, and that's again only every now and then too.
So this is like, I have never put this quite so explicitly together in my mind until just this moment. But like I, you know, besides just kind of being shy and kind of in my shell through like, you know, all the way up through high school, when I was starting to come out of that in high school, I did that through theater, but not as an actor, as part of the stage crew. So like literally I would appear in between scenes.
Wow.
in the dark or
Yeah,
in the half light of the main lights kind of turned down to their minimum.
I
Yeah,
love
that's
that.
hilarious.
That's great. Yeah, that is so mercurial. Um, okay, let's start talking about, you know, the differences between Mercury and domicile versus exalted and detriment and fall. I guess it's safe to, I mean, I kind of, when I was learning, I always thought like, okay, Mercury just has two signs. Has a domicile in both Virgo and Gemini. But then I kind of learned that like, it's also like, it doesn't have another sign that's exalted in, and no, people, Mercury is not exalted in Aquarius. I don't know where you heard it, but that's not a thing. It does have some dignity there, but it's definitely not exalted there. So yeah, I mean, I guess it's safe to say that. What are you guys? What do you know about that? Because that's something that has always kind of confused me. Like, it's at home. It has like domicile in both signs, Gemini and Virgo, but it's also exalted in Virgo, and I'm not really sure how that works.
Well, it's weird because it's the only planet that has that.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody else's exaltation is in some other sign, not one of its domiciles. And usually a sign that has like it's not really obvious why
Mm-hmm.
necessarily. I mean, you know, Jupiter's exaltation is, you know, in it's Cancer, and Saturn's exaltation is in Libra, and like, you know, stuff like that. It's like
Mm-hmm.
Mercury gets his exaltation and his domicile in Virgo. One thing that's interesting is that if you look at the Thema Mundi, which is, you know, if you're into traditional astrology, this thing will end up coming up, and it's like this sort of archetype. It's like a different archetype as opposed to the Aries rising, you know, astrological alphabet type archetype. But it's an archetype from way back in the day, and that would give Virgo to the third sign, the third topic, third house,
Mm-hmm.
which happens to be the joy of the moon. Joy is like some obscure um, dignity that the planets have.
Here's the theme
And
of Monday I just pulled up.
yeah, and so having that is kind of interesting. That would also, you know, the other thing being that the exaltation is something of a lunar distribution or grant, as
Mm-hmm.
like as the domicile rulerships are sort of come from the sun, the exaltations come from the moon in a way,
Mm-hmm.
and that sort of relates to, I think I would say, more of a lunar uh, aspect to that dignity, where maybe an aspect in terms of influencing the body of the person, or the sort of the the soul, but the soul in the sense of the sort of dynamic emotional self that a person
Mm-hmm.
has. And in some ways, because the moon rules fortune, it could also be associated with fortune. It could be associated with the kind of sort of outside events that occur to a person, or that the circumstances that the person finds themselves in.
Mm-hmm.
And that would affect Mercury in that way. That Mercury sort of finds himself in situations where he gets to run stuff, where he gets to
Mm-hmm.
run the show and not have to like answer to anybody.
Mm-hmm.
So that suits Mercury just fine. And also, one of the things that Mercury, one of the many significations that Mercury gets associated with in antiquity is the mysteries and esoteric knowledge, philosophical knowledge, but also effectively what's magical or mystical stuff.
The
Things that we
magician.
usually, yeah, the magician, but also, yeah, like the mystic. So things that modern day we would probably put on Neptune,
Mm-hmm.
and in antiquity, these things are clearly associated with Mercury. So this is another way this exaltation in the third, in its own sign, sort of keys in, because that's that whole cadent axis there is the moon being
Mm-hmm.
in its joint third and the sun being in its joint the ninth, and that sort of dynamic of the lights of the heavens. Mercury is sort of involved with in an non-obvious way in between the worlds. Another aspect of cadent houses
Mm-hmm.
in antiquity is that they are metakosmios, which is they're in between the world, or like they're outside the world, but they're also sort of like in between the world. There's liminal place. They're like
Mm-hmm.
in the gaps in everything
Right.
and around everything, and that all also suits Mercury just fine, because Mercury is all about uh, being everywhere and anywhere,
Nooks and crannies.
whenever. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's, I
Awesome.
don't know, I think I was contemplating that at one point too, and I was like, well, like what case could be made in some other sign? And it really just doesn't work anywhere else. It's sort of
Mm-hmm.
like left over. It's like almost by process of elimination, once you distribute the exaltations for the other planets, it's just like there's no other spot that it kind of makes sense, especially if you need to adhere to it needing to make an aspect. So it's definitely one of the reasons the Aquarius thing doesn't work by traditional
Yeah.
logic. But yeah, so I don't know. Like, I mean, I think Gabe gave a great answer, because I don't think I've steeped enough in the historical literature to have a better answer to that. But I think there's an image that I always sort of come back to with Mercury and Virgo that starts to point me in some interesting like directions of thought with this, which is that in Gemini, um, Gemini basically offers no check to Virgo's excesses.
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, to kind of more borrow from the from Chinese philosophy, if the nature of Mercury would have to be associated with an element, it would definitely go with the wood element, or with the wood phase, which is associated with wind. Yeah, as a force in nature, but also as a process in the body, in the phenomenal body, and it is also associated with like roots and shoots, especially like new roots and shoots. So also kind of connecting to youth, which is, and wood is also connected to spring. So it all kind of like
Mm-hmm.
syncs up together. So it's this like twisting, winding, bending, kind of adapting to, and doesn't really, like, it kind of has a direction, but it's not going to go there in a straight line.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in the air, which is the actual wind itself, like Mercury is just as windy as it can be. So it's the little seeds of dandelion floating in the air. It's kind of the movement of like hummingbirds and honeybees and other pollinators. It's just like this thing. It's like flitting this way and that way. But if you take that wood energy, that kind of like erratic, kind of not straight, kind of like bouncing sideways and back and forth into the earth of Virgo,
Mm-hmm.
like it becomes like the beginnings of like the root system. Like it, like the earth kind of provides a buffer. Like, I don't know. I guess it sort of makes me think of like the way that some people rationalize um, the sect that each malefic belongs to as kind of
Mm-hmm.
having a tempering or countering
Mm-hmm.
effect on the malefic, and therefore it is better. It functions better there. So I almost kind of think of Mercury in an Earth sign and particularly in a mutable earth sign being the most kind of like the most functional place for it. Because like when I think of mutable earth, I think of like soft dirt or like soil that's like fresh.
Sand.
Clay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, maybe not sand, because like there's no nutrient to draw from sand. You can move through sand.
You can make it
but
glass.
it's sort of that also true. Also true. But I feel like it exacerbates the dryness quality that some associate with Mercury too. So you have the stability of Earth with sort of like the wetness of like dark soil, which is what I would sort of associate what I think of when I think about mutable Earth. And it just gives a place that Mercury can like do more and do more over like a longer arc of time, versus like what happens in Gemini is extremely like transient and brief. And if not a root system, then the other image that I like to think a lot about is like fungi in the mycelial network. And just sort of like, when I see that like time lapse of those little like white threads like branching through like dark soil, I'm like, boom, like that's totally Mercury and Virgo.
Yeah.
And I think that specific metaphor too really works too, because it brings into this idea of the way that fungi like digest things, like it breaks down and decomposes, which is sort of like related to the analytical function of Mercury. So it takes like is capable of digesting like raw material and breaking them down into their constituent parts, but not just for the sake of breaking down. Like it's for the sake of breaking down in order to render it reabsorbable by other forms of life, which kind of like, in modern astrology, there's that connection between Virgo and service, and like that's the nature of service that I kind of most strongly associate it with, because it's also an invisible kind of surface. Like you don't see the mycelium doing its work. It's like happening out of sight in the dirt, in the dark. And yeah, I don't know. So there's lots of different ways in which Virgo in Mercury just makes sense, like in terms of its strength in domicile and exaltation.
I love that. Yeah, I kind of think of the difference between Gemini and Virgo as like Gemini is about just the raw, like the data, like give me the data, give me the information, and how Gemini just like seeks to kind of like putting out feelers, like it wants to kind of like touch all the things to gather information about it, and to make connections between different things. I think that's a really big thing when it comes to Gemini, is like the connections piece. Whereas Virgo is a lot more discerning, and it wants to take all that information and categorize it and throw out what's not useful, and then take everything that is useful and make it kind of like systematize it, and make it basically like useful is like the number one word I think of with Virgo, and making it, figuring out how to like you said with the fungi, it takes it and makes it useful for other organisms. And that's very much how I see Virgo acting. Like it's like, sure, give me all this information. Not all of this is going to be useful for everything. So let's figure out how to like put it into the right categories and systematize it so that, it can be digestible. Which, you can do that with information and facts and data. It's also why like analyzing and analytics is such like a Mercurial Virgo thing, because it's about, it's not just about the data, which is a lot more Gemini. With analytics, it's like, what are we using this data for? Any other thoughts about, I guess like to kind of like put it more into like, what is Mercury in Gemini like? Because I get a lot of clients with a lot of Gemini clients, and a lot of them with Mercury in Gemini, especially pretty close to their sun, which I definitely see Mercury under the beams in Gemini acting way more functional, I guess, than any other planet under the beams, even if they are in their own chariot. Mercury just seems to, like, especially in Gemini, like it doesn't really like hinder it as much. But I see that a lot, and a lot of them are writers. A lot of them are people who just like are really like have always just been, you know, people who really can absorb information and like I said, make connections between a lot of different things and kind of can hold a lot at once. Um, yeah, a lot of writers. Yeah. And then I guess sorry, go ahead.
Oh, the other thing that sort of jumps into my mind as you're talking, and kind of, I think this is connected to writing in a certain way, is I feel like the difference in both Gemini and in Virgo, like Mercury, is they're both doing connecting work, right? And they're both spreading things out. But there's a way in which like Gemini has, I mean, yeah, again, totally like appropriate to its air element quality. There's less of a sort of like sustained involvement attachment in a certain way. Like it's almost like what happens in a Gemini mode is like the thing has been like carried from point A to point B, and like that is where it will be left. And I kind of think of writing in a similar way. It's like you go through this process and like you're generating this product, but then it's like out in the world. It's like out of your hands. Like, you know, it's like it's not, you know, it might have your name on it, but it's sort of like doesn't really belong to you anymore. Whereas I feel like a more Virgo mode is like there's a more sustained like regular tending to in order to maintain that connection. Whereas like that pollination mode of Gemini is like, okay, like has the thing been distributed to where it needs to go? Like, okay, we're done. Like we'll move on to the next thing. So there's like there's a difference in intimacy, it almost feels like, between Mercury's two domiciles.
Mm-hmm. One thing with like Mercury, I'm just trying to think of my friends with like Mercury and Virgo versus Mercury in Gemini. I definitely see with Mercury and Virgo, there's this like eloquence with it almost. I think maybe that comes with like the precise nature of Virgo. Like Mercury and Virgo people just have the best words. Like I don't know where you guys get it from, but you can come up with these like just like these perfect words. And I think that Mercury and Gemini is also really good at coming up with words, but I see it more as just like always having a like always being able to add something, always being able to like, you know, continue the conversation. And with Mercury and Virgo, it's a lot more careful, a lot more precise. You know, it's a little slower. And I mean, I just recorded with Drew and Scarlett yesterday, and Scarlett has Mercury and Virgo, I think on Regulus too.
I think I knew that.
Yeah, and so I mean, she just comes up with like the best words, and so do you. And it's like my Mercury and Sag is just like, oh, if only that. I feel like I have the most basic vocabulary, and that's just something I had to accept about myself because like
I actually read the thesaurus for fun.
See, I mean,
in middle school.
So did I when I was in school. Because
oh my God, you Virgos. I mean, I would have done that. Like I love the thesaurus, but my brain cannot retain any of it. Like maybe we can kind of switch and talk about Mercury and Sag. Because yeah, for me, it's like, I see Mercury and Sag as really, I guess, like the way I think of it is like, I guess I think things in like images, and I kind of think of Mercury and Sag as like this little Mercury in the middle of like the wild, wild west or something. And seeing that there's so much to take in and like really, really wanting to take everything in, but like it's like an impossible job. It's just too much for one little Mercury to carry. And I really see like my Mercury and Sag is, I have a really, like I'm very Mercurial, and that's like very, I think, evident to everyone because it's so loud, it's so angular, and everyone sees it. It's on my midheaven. But I don't think people see how difficult it is for me to Mercury. Like even right now, like I'm like out of breath just trying to talk, and like you know, writing for me, I do it. I've done it a lot. I wrote a fucking book somehow, and I literally am like somehow. I don't know how I did that, but it takes like 10 times the amount of effort for me to just do very simple mercurial tasks like speaking and, you know, writing, but also, I don't know, just like, I feel like I very much like overdo with the Mercury and the Jupiter because they're both in detriment and both angular. And I tend to be someone that like, I'm very, very organized, and people see that about me. Like, whoa, like if you look at my calendar, oh, I have all the like everything's color coordinated, and you know, I have all these different colored pens and different notebooks for things. And it's honestly,
I knew that somehow.
yeah.
I knew that about you somehow. I never saw it, but I'm like, this is
I'm
Kira's
very
this
much
kind of person.
like that. Yeah. And it's because it's like, I literally have to, or else I would not be able to function. I like would not be able to function in the world, like, you know, in the professional world or whatever, if I wasn't hyper organized the way I am, because it's like my Jupiter in Virgo has to set up these systems so that my Mercury can like do Mercury. Yeah, like I think I just cannot retain information. So it has to be, or like I have to put it in the right place when it comes to me, or else it's going to get lost. And I'll maybe think of it like before I go to bed or something. But yeah, my Mercury and Sag needs the structure that my Jupiter and Virgo provides. And they work together in that way, which is cool. But I can't just like, I'm not someone that, you know, you can tell, okay, like you get to the 7-Eleven by going left here, turn right on Elm, then turn left again. I need to write it down and I need to look at a map. My Mercury just cannot hold all of it. How do you guys see Mercury and Sag?
Well, I mean, you're a bit of a special case because you sort of have this mutual reception thing with
Yeah.
Jupiter and Mercury. So, but I mean, everybody who's listening, go back and listen to what Kira said, how her Mercury doesn't work well, and or she just trouble handling information while she runs a podcast and put out a magazine, and is this weekend is hosting a seminar, like 12 speaker series, and is probably concocting some other things, probably writing another book.
This podcast, yeah.
The middle of this podcast, while we're talking, she's like jotting that. She's like in chapter 12 of some whatever fucking book she's writing now. So it's like, yeah, what a terrible. You're doing horribly.
I don't think I'm doing horribly. It's just really hard to do it.
But you do.
Yeah, I mean,
so much.
I'm doing. That's Mercury and Sag, just like literally doing the most.
Yeah, it's in a place where it's not comfortable in, hosted by somebody who likes all the opposite things Mercury likes. So it's like the analogy for detriment is essentially you're at your friend's house, or maybe they're not a friend, but or maybe they're like your family member where you don't get along with, or they're vegan, you like steak, they like they're listening to opera, you want your heavy metal or whatever weird diametric opposite that you can conceive of. That's sort of that relationship, and that's the issue, is that you're somewhere where you don't want to be really, and you don't really enjoy this. but you're gonna make do because you're stuck here.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
Not
what
even
Mercury,
stuck, like compelled to, you know, like
yeah.
that's the angularity. It's just like, well, I'm not gonna do that. Like that's
No, no, I'm definitely gonna do it. Well, that's with the curious, like we're definitely gonna make something out of this, and that's the thing. Mercury has to work with all the big picture, big deal, big project, support the community, support everything, wide ranging effects that Jupiter is into, and so Mercury's gotta like, okay, well, that's what I gotta do then, and not moving giant things around,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to be supportive when you. The reality is, I don't want to support anything. I want to mess around with stuff, but I gotta do this. I gotta do that, and so it creates that sort of frenetic, anxious uh, behavior
Yeah.
in wherever it's doing. So that's why you're like, oh, I'm out of breath because you just don't stop moving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, fire has an even more kinetic quality than air does, right? So like,
yeah,
there's
definitely.
like a lot of freaking energy, and like plugging that into a planet whose nature is to not stop moving. That would be a lot to deal with. I mean, in a way, it's sort of, like, yeah, I mean, that's sort of like an excess quality that the fire quality, the element of Sagittarius is lending to Mercury, but it is in Jupiter's sign, and I think Jupiter. I mean, this is why they're paired up. Is like I think that's how Jupiter helps to balance Mercury. It's like one thing, one thing, and it sort of like provides some grounding and stability. So if there is like a clear vision, which I think is both a fire and a Jupiter thing, that can be really like anchoring for Mercury in a certain kind of way. Um, uh, and I think the other thing that I really just like love I think about fire signs in general is like fire energy is like so good at hyping, right? So like to put Mercury there, and like maybe in Sagittarius most of all, is like you want to get a message out to as far as it possibly can, to as many people as you possibly can. Like I think Sagittarius is like a really good place for Mercury to do that. Yeah, and I also have to wonder because like again thinking about the planetary contrariety between Mercury and Jupiter, because my Jupiter is in Saturn sign in the sixth. I feel like I really like lack some of the counterbalancing effects that Jupiter has. So I totally can lose the big picture in a way that's like very easy, and so I'm like totally lost in the present minutia, which is something that I think makes it really hard to focus Mercury's energy and Mercury's efforts into something that's like a long-term goal. Like Mercury is much more preoccupied with like what is immediately happening, which is great in its own way. But if you are trying to accomplish something that requires like a 5-10 year plan, like that's not gonna work, especially if it's mostly Gemini and Mercury energy. Like that's gonna be really hard to like funnel in a direction.
Yeah.
So yeah, I feel like yes, because they're Jupiter and Mercury have opposite signs, like there is this sense of discomfort, of exile, of maybe like not functioning exactly in the way that it would most prefer, but there is there's definitely some moderating balancing effects going on too by being in the opposite sign that I think can work like really, really well. I feel like I had something else. Oh, come back to me.
Yeah, I mean, I really see, especially with like clients, Mercury and Sag. Oftentimes it's like people are like, like the way that they communicate is very blunt and to the point, which is like a very Sag thing, because it's all about conveying truth. It's like,
Yeah.
I just want to tell you the truth. And, you know, that's something for me. I'm like, I cannot lie. Like, I'm really bad at lying. And maybe it's because I was raised by a Sagittarius mother and she was like, don't lie to me.
I
But
have the same problem.
yeah. But yeah, there's this element of like, you know, the delivery of Mercury and Sag being very yeah, direct and to the point. And it's like, you know, I mean, that's like a fire sign thing too.
Yeah. It's a
But yeah.
sincerity. I feel like it's more, there's like a trustworthiness. Like, I mean, that's the negative, that's a negative signification of Mercury, right? Like, is lying.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that makes perfect sense.
That's so true.
Why, you know, in Jupiter's sign, it's just like, nope, not very good at that.
Right. Yeah, and I guess another thing just being like, yeah, I like what you said before about just wanting to convey a message like far and wide. I very much feel that way about my Mercury. It's like, you know, it's literally like having a microphone or like a megaphone. Because it's
All
Sag
caps.
is very loud. Yeah. I usually say that about Mercury in Leo, but I think with Mercury and Leo, it's more about like having a microphone and like being on stage and being like, listen to me, I'm gonna share this message in a really entertaining way. In Sag, it's just like, no, you need to hear the truth, and I'm here to deliver the truth. And I guess in contrast to that, Mercury in its fall in Pisces, also Jupiter ruled, but there's this element of, well, in water, Mercury is considered mute in all of the water signs. And that's because you can't talk underwater. Just you can't do it. But you learn how to communicate in other ways. And one of the ways I like to describe Mercury in Pisces, or in any water sign, but especially in Pisces, there's this nonverbal communication and you know, communicating very much like psychically a lot of the times, or just through compassion and empathy, and like communication just becomes this a totally different thing when you're talking about Mercury and Pisces. Poetry comes to mind, like music and like beautiful lyricism and painting, like art, like communicating through art and movement and dance and yeah, even like palm reading for some reason just came to my mind, and things that have to do with like, you know, more psychic and spiritual methods of conveying information. um and and yeah, it's in its fall in Pisces. Opposite is exaltation in Virgo, because it doesn't do Mercury in like in a normal Mercury way. It's not communicating through these facts and figures and data and yeah, it's doing it in this very like liminal way. I have to do the hands with that.
That's totally something I notice about Mercury in Pisces. It's like, I mean, I think it's true in general. Like, I mean, this is something that social sciences say, that like the you know, the larger scent of like meaningful communication is not actually happening through words. It's like what we're doing with our whole body. But I feel like that's just like extra true for Mercury in Pisces. Like it's yeah, it is not, it's an expression that has much more to do with gesture than it does with like language, because there's a way in which like words concretize and kind of like make solid and fixed and kind of like, this is a thing now, whereas like kind of Pisces has this very anti-thingness to it, because it's like all together.
Yeah,
You know,
it's
it's
like
like
very
all connected, all.
non-material.
Yeah.
And I think also think of that as a polarity between like analysis and synthesis. Like, I think Mercury in its normal mode is more of an analytical planet, but you know, in Pisces, like as a water sign and also ruled by Jupiter, it's way more synthetic. So it's like where you expect Mercury to be able to draw a distinction between things. Like, it seems like Mercury in Pisces, like has a much more natural instinct towards drawing the connection between things. Like, it's like, how are these two things the same, or like share the same like essence? Which also totally connects to poetry, because poetry is a synthetic way of using language. It's like totally breaking down all the normal buckets and delineations that separate one word from another word. It's like you're using words in a way that they're not normally. You're finding these more obscure or like related meanings of words, or like how words are fitting together, but not necessarily always like what one word specifically means. Yeah, I don't know. I don't. I mean, I love poetry, but I think I love poetry because it helps me balance against the way that my Mercury really functions in a highly analytical way. And I think, you know, where there's like a learning edge for me when I'm sort of a little bit more engaged in poetry as a practice is like, okay, like how attached am I to to using this one word because I feel like it means exactly the thing that I want it to mean. Like, and sort of like, how do I let that go? Which totally extends into like my tarot practice too, because like I kind of picked back up tarot around the same time I picked back up astrology, but I got back into tarot through Tarot de Marseille, and like most of the tarot readers that read with that deck either have a much softer hold or an outright rejection for one card having any set meaning. It's just like whenever you like lay out a spread, like you have to kind of almost like go into this like beginner's mind, just like not even remembering what any one card means by itself, and just seeing how all of them like weave together as like and tell one story, which I think is also feels like a very Pisces thing, and a Mercury in Pisces thing. And actually I got back into tarot when Mercury had its long retrograde in Pisces
of course
last year, so it's just like perfect.
Yeah, tarot is such a Mercury and Pisces like medium, I feel like, because you're like painting a picture through these like cards are so mercurial too. I love that. I always think of like Mercury and Pisces. I love Mercury and Pisces because I have Mercury in detriment, and my favorite thing is to be able to tell a Mercury and Pisces, like when they're trying to explain something to me, it's like, I get it. You don't have to keep explaining.
Totally.
Because I can read your Jupiterian Mercury.
Yep.
I just feel it. I feel it.
Yeah, it's more like a collage or an impressionistic painting. It's just like, this word, it's not what I mean, but it's like kind of close. And then they like put this other one like kind of here, and then they do a thing with their hands. It's like, oh, you mean this thing? It's like, yes, that.
Yeah. And it's almost like a faucet, like oftentimes like a faucet turning on, and like Mercury and Pisces people oftentimes like can't stop talking. They just kind of, the words just like flow and flow and flow, and it's messy, which is fine. You know, I prefer it. I definitely do, because it makes me feel like, you know, we can just throw words out there. My whole philosophy as like a Mercury and Sag is like, if I can like pick up what you're saying, if I can understand like the basic meaning, then like you don't have to correct yourself. Typos, I don't give a shit. Like, I really don't care if you can spell, as long as I get what you're saying. Where I feel like a Mercury in Virgo is like not about it. Not about that life.
No. It better be right.
That's not what that means.
Exactly.
Well, actually, that's like straight up. Well, that's where it goes into its actually phase. Yeah.
Oh God, I really try to check that part of myself.
No, you're good with it. You're not. Yeah.
My dad is like that. He has like a really intense Virgo stellium. Like it's like Saturn in Virgo, Venus in Virgo, and South Node in Virgo, I think. And Mercury might also be in Virgo. Yeah.
He's a well actually.
He does a lot of well actuallying. Yes.
I love that. Gabe, do you have thoughts on Mercury and Pisces?
I don't know if there's anything left. You covered over a lot. I do think going back to, let's do the mirror image of the Mercury and Virgo stuff, you know, in the Mundi, Pisces would be the ninth house. So it's properly the house of religion and traveling to temples and mysteries and
Divination.
divination, seeing wonders. And Mercury in and of itself has signification over astrology and stargazing and all that. So as the ninth house, because it's divination. So it's interesting that that house would be the house that it is, you know, in its depression, in its fallen state, uh, in an element that's alien to it, and in a domicile of Jupiter, which is it's not happy with. So it's interesting that it gets put in that situation, and I think that sort of sets up the scene of how divination works, or at least operates in. It's not it's not organic chemistry, where I know if I put 2 moles of this and 1 mole of that, I'm going to get 1 mole of this, and it's going to be like a very specific operation. It's a more nebulous world where you're sort of at the mercy of uh, the universe, the cosmos, the sort of amorphous permeability of water, and you sort of have to. You have an idea, you know what you sort of know what you're going to do, but you have to sort of ride the wave too and try to find what it is that you're looking, what it is you're trying to say.
You're making soup. It's just like,
yeah,
does this taste right yet? No.
Soup thing, yeah.
Yeah, it's very not recipe oriented.
Yeah.
No, it's definitely to your taste.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that. I really appreciate that reflection, Gabe, of like the whole like Pisces, ninth house, divination, Mercury soupiness. Yeah, I'm gonna sit with that because I really enjoy that. Yeah. Well, to start to wrap up, I would love to talk about, you know, like ways to work with Mercury, ways to maybe strengthen your Mercury, which feels like, I don't know, do many people try to strengthen them? I mean, I guess I do, you know, wearing a fucking talisman, but yeah, ways to work with Mercury. And also, I guess like, yeah, you know what, I'm gonna leave it at that. What are ways people can work with Mercury?
Well, I mean, I think let's do it in a Mercurial way and try to be analytical about it and look at how Mercury is in your chart, what it's responsible for, what condition it's in, and pinpoint if there's a problem. You know, is there a problem? Where's the problem coming from? What kind of problem is it? Mm-hmm. Is it a Marsy problem? Is it, you know, as someone with a Mercury Mars conjunction, do you not know when to not say that? Could you not tell the cop to fuck himself? Could you just maybe not do that? You gotta like, yeah, you gotta, you know, sometimes you gotta learn the hard way, Kira. and
I'm so thankful.
Hopefully the audience will listen. Yeah, hopefully the audience will listen to us and not do that, and just like understand. Try to get the feel of your Mercury in your mind and in your spirit and in your life, and say, okay, this is how I'm using my words correctly or not, and then make allowance for that. Mm-hmm. Or look to see what helps. Look to see if there's some other influence that is a more benefic influence on Mercury, and say, okay, I have a problem that's coming from this. I'm gonna lean into that, and you know, to maximize your strengths, minimize your weaknesses. Sometimes because you can't make your weaknesses go away. You have to confront that this is okay. You have an issue. Let's just accept that what the issue is, and then I can deal with it. I can make room for it and sit with it and make peace with it. And this is like the general approach for anything.
Yeah.
In your chart, and this is probably. I mean, I'm you know, obviously there's people who use talismans, and you know, you can say the Orphic hymn on Mercury hour on a Wednesday, Saturday night. You can do stuff like that. You can do meditative approaches, like try to just think of your Mercury and like vision one thing is like you look at your chart, try to picture your chart in your mind, and then focus on the planet in the chart, and then start to see its all relationships. This is a good way to try to memorize all your dignities and all that, and try to sort of identify with it formally, and then just see where that goes in like a journey, like a journeying thing. There's that. Uh, another thing would be to think about Mercury in a meditative aspect and like in a sort of witness aspect. So you think of things in that realm of Mercury and however it is in your chart, and just you try to watch it in your mind. You don't try to embody it. You try to watch it on TV, and then see where that goes. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to not get caught up in it. So you're just trying to watch it linger on, and see where it ends up going, and see how it reduces down to what fundamentals of it are. And then you could just cry. You could just cry all the time. that always works too.
Especially if you have Mercury in Pisces or
Yes,
Cancer.
just cry all the time.
I love that. One thing I would say is utilize Mercury retrogrades. I'm like all about taking advantage of Mercury retrogrades and honoring them for what they are, and using it as a time for, just like you see online, review, rethink, reorganize. But I think it's important to honor when Mercury is slowing down and then going retrograde, and you can get so much out of like just paying attention to when that happens, and then purposefully like being mindful, and then slowing down too, and using those periods of time to your advantage. And that looks like, reorganizing stuff. It also depends, like what Gabe said earlier, what is it responsible for? Meaning, what houses does it rule in your chart? Where is Gemini and Virgo in your chart? And then do you have planets in Gemini and Virgo? Mercury is responsible for them. And so when Mercury is retrograde every season, every 3 months or so, being aware that those planets too, like their lord, their host is, not moving forward, and just kind of like holding that in your mind and kind of figuring out how, what that may look like during these retrograde periods. So yeah, I'm all about Mercury retrogrades and using them to your advantage. Perhaps, look to see if Mercury was close to either retrograde when you were born, close to a retrograde station, or station direct too, and seeing like how fast Mercury was moving when you were born. I was born like 10 days before a Mercury retrograde. So my progressed Mercury has been retrograde since I was around 10 or 11 years old, which coincided with me beginning to study astrology, of course. And it's going direct in almost exactly a year. I think it's like August 1st next year. And I'm really looking forward to that. But that's something like that's really significant for me, is like knowing that my progressed Mercury is retrograde, has been retrograde, and kind of like looking forward to what it might mean when it goes direct. Especially because it is like in detriment, but in such a prominent place in my chart. So yeah, take a look. You can do that just by looking into it in ephemeris, which you can look up online for the year that you were born, or it's definitely best to have one, a physical one. But taking a look to see like what phase Mercury was in when you were born, and how close it was to a retrograde, because you could be coming up on a progressed retrograde soon. You don't even know it, or you might have just gotten out of one. So take a look at that. Jason, do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, when I saw this question, I was initially a little bit stumped, and then I was like, oh, do I like do I have too much Mercury privilege to be able to answer this?
You definitely do. We don't want to hear from you. No.
So I guess the only thing that really comes to mind is just like really zooming in on like Mercury's basic significations and kind of like turning them into like a practice of sorts. You know, if Jupiter kind of like weaves together the big picture and kind of like, you know, joins things together in this unity, then, you know, one of Mercury's natural function is like, how are these things different? Like, what is the difference between these things? And I find that that is a very natural way for my mind to work. And like how I learn about things is actually like to learn, like to figure out what's different about things, and then sort of like circle back to that unity through distinction. So I think that like that could be something. I think just, you know, I mean, it's pretty basic, but writing, like literally trying to put anything into words is a Mercury function. And so I feel like if that is a thing that is challenging, like there's so many rich ways to engage with that as a conscious practice, because there is something different that happens in your mind when it's like, when you're sitting there and something occurs to you. For some people, it is like immediately like, it has words, I could write it out, what I just thought. But for a lot of people, it's more of this like proto thought, like it's like not, it's like a shape of a thought. And like Mercury's job is actually to turn that shape into something that's like more cut and more like distinguished, and something that you can put into words. You know, like almost like a sculptor or a carver, you know, you're just supposed to like chip away the things that aren't, you know, what you're trying to say, and it's like what's left over is like what you're trying to express. And like that's kind of what Mercury is trying to do. So yeah, utilizing language in that way, and kind of taking that step of like forcing your proto thought into one that is like communicable, like I think taps into that Mercurial function. I think in thinking about the relationship between the Mercury and the Sun, actually, there's an interesting way in which, like, both of you brought this up about, like, you know, Gabe, you talked about observing your thoughts and kind of like just seeing like what comes up in your mind, you know, and Gary, you mentioned also like, you know, the practice of mindfulness and just like meditation in general. I think that's a practice that sort of unifies like Sun and Mercury functions. It's almost like when you are taking that mindful perspective, you're taking a step back from Mercury actually, and kind of like centering in the Sun. Like, you know, the signification of the Sun of intelligence is not like sort of the way that we usually think about intelligence when we say that word in English. It's more the capacity of awareness in a way. And so like when you're taking that mindful step, you're kind of like resting in the light of consciousness of the Sun and observing what Mercury is doing, which I think both strengthens Mercury, but also kind of like balances Mercury's excess. Like if you're someone who's caught up in like the frenetic like motion and activity of Mercury, being able to kind of like center in kind of the light of the Sun's awareness and sort of see Mercury from a distance, kind of makes it feel a lot less frenetic, a lot less anxious, you know, kind of finding that position of calm that is like outside of what Mercury is doing. But also in that relationship is also, you know, what is it like to just stand like between things rather than in front of things. You know, the Sun is about stepping out into the light and kind of taking that foregrounded position, versus like Mercury is like off to the side, if not like in the background. And so there's almost sort of like a humility practice that I think is like kind of connected, that could be connected to the way that Mercury functions. So I think all of those things are things that I can sort of see turning into practices if you were to, you know, want to tap Mercury's energy.
Yeah, I love that. Everything you said was really great, really, really important things, I think, to kind of sit with, especially the piece about like mindfulness kind of more as like a solar practice and being able to more observe Mercury. Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you both for being a part of this, having this like super mercurial discussion with me. I had so much fun. Um, why don't you tell everyone where they can find you? Gabe, where can everyone find you?
Well,
I
right
know you're gonna
now,
say
the usual
Twitter, but
Twitter, that's the place. That's the place is Gibelresh on Twitter. Right. Eventually, there'll be a website. Eventually, I'll probably announce that on Twitter, as that's the only place you can find that. So right now,
Awesome.
just if you're gonna come for me there, and then I'll deal with
Awesome.
you.
Yeah, and we'll have links to Gabe's Twitter below. And Jason, how about you?
Kind of the same. I don't really have a public presence as far as astrology. Like I said, I feel like I'm still kind of in an apprenticeship mode, so I don't feel, uh, yeah, that I ready to hang out my sign, so to speak. But also, like, you know, it's in Virgo in my rising signs. It's my first whole sign, but it is very much in my 12th quadrant. And I'm about to enter a 12th house perfection. So even I might even get a little bit scarce on
Going to the
Twitter.
shadows.
Yeah, exactly. So
So
yeah,
I'm lucky I got
just
you on here.
exactly. Yep. It's
Before that.
only a month away from my birthday. So
Oh, well, people can find you on Twitter in the meantime, and we'll have that link below. Thank you both so much. I hope to, be able to talk to you again soon. We should. I feel like earlier in quarantine we were gathering a lot more online. So
Maybe they'll come again.
yeah, we'll see. Probably not until after after this shitstorm of a year is over, but we'll see. We'll see. All right, guys. Thank you.
Thank you so
thank
much,
you.
Kira.